Alrighty, guys. So here are the pest control methods notes. As I said in class, these are going to be a little different from what we went over in class. So feel free to annotate the notes that you received so that way you can go ahead and make sure you have all the information. So before we get into pest control, let's make sure we define pest. So, a pest is any sort of noxious organism that damages crops. It's going to damage some sort of plant that we're growing. This can include insects, mites, which are in the same group as spiders. They're not spiders, but let's put related to spiders. So they'll have like 8 legs, etc. Nematodes, which are worms. Plant pathogens, which are any sort of disease causing agents. They can be bacteria, fungi, or viruses. Weeds, which are any plants that we are not trying to grow in an area. And vertebrates, a lot of times this is going to be birds or rodents, though that's not the only type of vertebrate that's involved. For example, a pest could be deer. Deer are pests in certain areas of the country. And so here, what we're seeing on the right is you see a plague of locusts or a swarm of locusts. So locusts can periodically group into these giant swarms of like millions of insects that can descend on an area and just completely ravage the fields. So they consume plant matter. They eat it, so we're not able to harvest it. You have other things like this is tobacco mosaic virus. Well, this is tobacco that's been infected by tobacco mosaic virus. So, this is kind of the healthier leaf at the beginning of the infection, and it gets sicker and sicker. And as it gets sicker, it has more of these kind of brown splotches. Eventually, the plant sickens and dies. You can't harvest it, you can't sell it. And if this was a food crop, you wouldn't be able to use it for food either. So, why do we care about pests? Well, because an estimated 20 to 40% of the crops that are produced around the world are eaten by pests, which means you can't sell them, you can't eat them, and that's a loss of about $220 billion worldwide. Here I have an image showing soybean yield losses in 2012 by pest and region. So you have pest losses due to weeds, insects, diseases, and animals. Notice that if you're somewhere like the Northern Plains, most of that is going to be lost due to weeds. Weeds grow in the area where you're trying to grow whatever desired plant, and then they take nutrients that you fertilize with, water that you irrigate with, and then they're, gonna use all those resources to grow instead of what you're trying to grow. Whereas if you're in the lake states, that's gonna be a little more insects. If you are in the corn belt, that's going to be more due to animals. So, one thing I want to point out with this is depending on what area you're in, what the conditions are like, what organisms live there, you're going to have different causes of crop loss due to pests. So, to deal with pests, we use something called pesticides. One note, when you see the suffix side at the end of a word, that means to kill. So, for example, homicide is killing hominids, humans. So you'll see side a lot as a suffix. So pesticides are substances that we use. They can be natural or they can be man-made that kill pests. And people tend to define what they consider as a pest. So what could be considered a pest in one area may not be considered a pest in another. For example, depending on what you're trying to grow, something might be considered a weed versus not. The United States uses a lot of pesticides, so we account for about a third of the world's pesticide use. This translates to about 227 million kilograms that we apply to the various plants that we're trying to go grow. That's food crops, fruit trees, as well as cotton, which is a you know big crop plant, I guess, here in the United States and around the world. So you can group pesticides a couple of ways. One, in how specific they are. So, if they are broad spectrum, they're going to kill many different types of pests. So, this pesticide, for example, which is dimethoate, is going to kill most insects and mites, which, like I said, are relatives of spiders as well as ticks. Or you can have a selective pesticide, which is just going to target a narrow range of organisms. When possible, it's better to use selective pesticides just because otherwise you may be killing beneficial insects. Because we've talked about, some mutually symbiotic relationships between insects and plants. So this acequinacil kills only mites. And so if you have a mite infestation of your plants that you're trying to grow, that might be a better choice to use than something like dimethoate, which would kill most organisms. But for something like this, you need to know what your pest is. Just like I was saying, you're going to see side a lot. Insecticides kill insects, some other invertebrates. Herbicides kill herbs or plants. Fungicides kill fungi, and rodenticides kill rodents, so things like rats and mice. You can also classify pesticides by their source. So, natural pesticides are, as their name implies, found in nature. They're found in nature and pretty much close to the form that we use them for. There's not a lot of chemical modification. Since they're naturally occurring, a lot of times there are processes in nature that can deal with them. So they tend to break down quickly. But because they break down quickly, you may have to apply them multiple times. Some naturally occurring compounds that are used are things containing sulfur, arsenic, lead, copper, and something called diatomaceous earth, which I have pictured right here. Diatomaceous earth contains like the remains of diatoms, which are these microscopic sea creatures that can have pointy shells. They have hard shells. And so the kind of all the jagged edges in that you can see are detrimental to an insect's exoskeleton. So they poke holes in the exoskeleton of the insect, and that allows fluid, their equivalent of blood, which is I believe hemolymph, to leak out, and that kills an insect. However, unless you inhale it, it's not going to be dangerous to humans. Um, One thing I want to point out, things like arsenic and lead, these are deadly to most creatures. So they're deadly to humans as well. And that's going to be a kind of common theme. A lot of things that we use as pesticides cause harm to humans too. Sometimes it needs to be in larger amounts, but if you're spreading arsenic on your field, that can contaminate the stuff you're growing. So that is not a good choice for a pesticide. Then people started using chemicals derived from plants, so botanically derived pesticides. There is a chemical called pyrethrum that comes from chrysanthemum flowers that can be used as a pesticide. And then back in the day, some people also used tobacco as a pesticide because the nicotine in it is a bit of an insect repellent, or at least it kills or makes insects sick. Synthetic pesticides, on the other hand, are made in factories, chemical processes, and unfortunately, they tend to be very stable. They can linger in the environment for a long time. So what I have here is an old ad for DDT, which is a type of synthetic pesticide that was used, DDT, dieldrin, aldrin, and malathion, which are examples of organochlorines and organophosphates, were kind of more heavily used after World War II, while synthetic pesticides began to be used in like the late 1800s. It's after World War II and all that rapid industrialization that we really started developing these chemical pesticides. Though, note, some of these were originally used for like chemical warfare. They were biological weapons, well, not biological weapons, chemical weapons against enemy soldiers in World War I and World War II. And then, people had made these chemicals. Laws were put in place and agreements to not use them. And so then countries have this stuff stockpiled up. What do we do with it? Well, it kills humans. Let's try it on insects. Kills insects. Okay, let's use it as a pesticide. There are four major categories of synthetic pesticides. Where I don't anticipate you being tested on those on the AP test. However, I did want to make sure to mention those examples like DDT is likely to, it could be mentioned on the test as an example of a pesticide. What's a disadvantage of it? Well, it lingers in the environment for a while. If I'm remembering correctly, DDT can linger for like 10 to 15 years. So if you apply DDT every year, that's cumulative. It builds up and then it gets into the ecosystem, it gets into organisms, and eventually it gets into us, which is a bad thing. So if you've been, using this traditional pest management for millennia, there's got to be some benefits to it. And if a lot of people use it today, there's some benefits. So it's rapid and it's pretty easy. You don't have to have a lot of knowledge. Like you don't need to know what specific pests you have. You can just choose something broad spectrum. The image you see here is a crop dusting plane. I'm not sure how much it's done now. I think they use helicopters a little more. But what they used to do back in the day is just have a plane that would spray pesticides over a field. Um, I think you can kind of see some negative consequences of that. For example, there's stories of people like playing outside and accidentally getting crop dusted with some pesticides. Not a good thing. Pesticides were, especially synthetic pesticides, were a really big component of the Green Revolution, where we saw that dramatic increase in food production. The Green Revolution, which we'll get a set of notes up soon, but we already talked about it in class, involved two main things. And this was the first Green Revolution, and that was synthetic fertilizers and synthetic pesticides. So the pesticides part allowed for greater crop yields, which meant we could produce more food on the same area, which means we could support the increase in population of humans, as well as decrease the amount of land that we were clearing. So we weren't clearing extra land so that we could have new farms because we were able to grow more on the same amount of land. However, there are lots of drawbacks that we're beginning to learn more and more about. For example, when you have pesticides just broadly applied, and especially if they're broad spectrum, they can have impacts on organisms that you're not trying to kill. So there are valuable soil or invertebrates, they're earthworms. There are some predatory mites that eat pests. Um, Other insects, beetles, honeybees, which do a lot of pollination, and some other wasp species that do pollination, um, can be also killed by these broad spectrum pesticides. And then any of these pesticides can actually be taken in by organisms. It may not kill them or make them sick. Then those get eaten by other organisms, and then it starts to enter the food chain, which can allow larger concentrations to build up and can cause problems there. Also, if you spray a bunch of pesticides on a field, the next time it rains, pesticides are going to come in your runoff, and that can go into your nearest aquatic system, rivers, streams, etc. And that can cause problems in fish as well. So fish larvae can develop these mutations that cause them to be kind of malformed, and then you can also have damage to various organs in fish. If there's a large enough amount of pesticide going into a body of water, it can even just straight up kill a bunch of the fish. Humans are also impacted by a lot of these chemicals. So, depending on which chemical it is, it could affect the nervous system, could irritate your skin or eyes. Some of this stuff, especially with repeated exposure, are carcinogens, which means they cause cancer. And a few of these can act like hormones and affect the endocrine system. You could have the effects be cumulative, meaning they build up over time. So you spray pesticides once a year, and that effect kind of builds up, damages an organ a little more every time. Or you can have an acute, large exposure that can cause serious illness or sometimes even death. So, agricultural workers who spray pesticides on fields, there have been some cases where they've been exposed to spills of pesticides and then they die. Another major impact is something called resistance. You've probably heard about antibiotic resistance. It's a similar process. So what happens is you have a population of, let's see, we have a bunch of bugs here, and each of those colors represents some genetic variation. So each of these bugs has some different genes. Now, you spray pesticides, and those pesticides end up killing most of the bugs. However, one of these bugs happens to have some variation, some gene difference that allows it to survive. And so that bug survives. All the other ones are dead. Now this bug has no competition, plenty of food, so it can reproduce like crazy. Then the next time you spray pesticide, those are all resistant. Those are all unkillable by your pesticide. And now you've got this population of bugs that you can't kill with the same chemical. That means you need to find another pesticide that will affect them, or that means that you need to find something stronger. And so that causes a big problem because then you need to keep constantly searching for new pesticides. Then you also have persistent pesticides, which are pesticides that are stable, that don't break down. Like I said, DDT can last in the environment for like 10 to 15 years, and these things can build up in the environment and in organisms. For example, the organochlorines type of synthetic pesticides actually end up getting stored in human fat, and then when those fat cells get broken down, those chemicals get broken down and kind of released into the blood and have their negative effects. So here in this diagram, we see pesticide application, and then you see it's leached below root zone and ultimately to water sources. That's it being carried by water trickling down and infiltrating through the soil. Then you have, pesticides containing soil surface runoff erosion. So you have this runoff that can impact bodies of water. You have other organisms in the area that can get exposed to the pesticides and then end up having these negative impacts. You can also have negative impacts on humans too. Then there's bioaccumulation. So that is an increase in concentration of a chemical in an organism compared to the concentration in the environment. So it builds up in organisms, and some of this stuff, if it doesn't break down, will build up over time. And so if you have some chemical that is taken up by living things faster than it's broken down, which can also be metabolized, or excreted, meaning basically pooped out or peed out, then it can accumulate in organisms, especially the persistent pesticides. And then another kind of negative consequence is, let's say you decide you're not going to use pesticides. You're going to genetically engineer a plant, and you're going to make it kind of, you know, uh, invulnerable to certain pests. So, for example, here you have a gene from a certain bacterium species, Bacillus thuringiensis, which scientists took a gene for something called Bt, which is poisonous to insects, and inserted it into a corn plant. So this corn plant is now transgenic or genetically modified, and it produces something toxic to these insects, which means it kills them. So here, the pest dies when it's feeding on the plant. But like I've said multiple times, it takes money, it takes years of research to create these varieties of plant. You don't just, oh, I'm going to take this gene from a bacterium and stick it in a corn plant, and 5 minutes later I have a transgenic corn plant. No, what ends up happening is you do thousands of trials. You do this over many years. You've got to test things. And so a lot of companies that are making these genetically engineered plants, they'll make one strain and then they'll be like, okay, everybody grow this one strain. They're not going to stop and say, okay, I'm going to spend another couple of million, $100 million creating, two or three more strains. So you end up having a loss of genetic diversity because you're just using that one strain. So we've talked about a lot of negative impacts. Next is going to be our lesson on integrated pest management, which is going to show ways to try and decrease some of these negative impacts of pest management.